The drainage canal behind Sector 9 smelled like rust and old rainwater. Nobody came out this far unless something was broken, and something was always broken on Aldrin's post. Dale had been working that pipe for 3 hours. He was 32 years old, broad in the shoulders, quiet in the way that comes from years of nobody asking your opinion. His hands were permanently stained with grease he couldn't fully wash out. He had no rank, no family on the colony. Most of his co-workers remembered his name only when the water stopped working. He was tightening the last coupling when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure in the air, a weight that hadn't been there before. He turned around slowly. She was at the edge of the tree line, about 15 meters away, partially hidden in the tall grass that grew wild past the fence. At first he thought it was an animal, one of the big ones that sometimes wandered down from the highlands. But the shape was wrong. The way she held herself was wrong. She was about the size of a large dog. Her scales were pale gold and ivory, layered like old coins in the light. Her wings were folded tight against her body, torn at the edges. One foreleg was trembling badly. Her eyes were open, pale amber, almost luminous, and they were looking directly at him. Dale did not run. He did not reach for his comm to report it. He did not call out to anyone. He just stood very still, the way he had learned to stand still when something fragile was happening and he didn't want to make it worse. "Hey," he said quietly. "You look pretty bad." She made a sound low in her throat, not threatening, more like someone agreeing with an obvious statement. He set down his wrench. He sat on the edge of the canal bank, not moving toward her, just bringing himself down to a less towering shape. He had half a meal left in his kit from lunch, a folded flatbread with some dried protein filling. He put it on the ground between them and pushed it a few centimeters in her direction. "I don't know if you eat that," he said. "Probably not, but it's all I've got." She watched him for a long time. Then she moved. It was slow, painful. She dragged herself through the grass on 3 legs, the 4th still shaking. She sniffed the food and ignored it. She came directly to him and stopped about a meter away, studying his face with those amber eyes like she was reading something written there. Dale didn't move. He just looked back. She stepped forward, lowered her head, and pressed her nose against his knee. Then she exhaled. The breath was warm and carried something with it that Dale could not name. It moved through him like a sound heard from very far away, not painful, not electric, just deeply present. Like the moment you realize someone is standing beside you in a dark room and you are not alone. Later, when he knew what it meant, he would try to remember what he had felt in that exact moment. The best he could ever describe it was this: it felt like being recognized. He put his hand on top of her head, very gently, because that seemed like the right thing to do. "All right," he said. He did not know he had just been chosen. He did not know that the creature beside him was an Orveth, one of the oldest and rarest species in the known galaxy, whose bonding ritual had not included a human being in all of recorded history. He did not know that 3 diplomatic vessels were currently in orbit around a planet called Vethora Prime, carrying the most powerful candidates in 6 species, all waiting for a choosing that would now never come to them. He did not know any of this. He knew that she was hurt, she was small, and she had chosen to trust him. He picked her up carefully. She was heavier than she looked, dense with something more than just flesh, and carried her back toward the colony with the quiet practicality of a man who had spent his whole life fixing things that needed fixing. He named her Suri because it had been his mother's name, and his mother had also been small and quietly fierce and largely overlooked by the world. That night, she slept across his legs on the narrow cot in his quarters, and Dale lay awake in the dark staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe. He thought, "I should probably report this." Then he thought, "Tomorrow." He did not report it the next day either, or the day after that. He just fixed the pipe in Sector 9, replaced a busted junction box on Level 4, and came home each evening to a small golden dragon who was always exactly where he left her. He had no idea the galaxy was already looking for her. He had no idea it was about to come looking for him. 3 weeks after the bond, a conclave diplomatic shuttle landed on Aldrin's post without warning. It came down in the main yard like a stone dropped from a great height. Too fast, too precise, showing off. 7 figures in formal dress filed out before the landing ramp had fully extended. They looked around at the dusty colony with the expressions of people who had stepped in something. At the front was Ambassador Rail of the Salvari. He was tall, with bioluminescent markings along his jaw that pulsed faintly when he was irritated, which was currently always. He had spent 7 years preparing one of his people, General Sovan, a decorated psychic commander with 3 campaign medals and an unbroken strategic record, for the Orveth choosing. Sovan had been in a preparation facility for 8 months. Meditation, resonance training, species cultural study, and then a juvenile Orveth had dragged herself out of a crash wreck and pressed her nose to a pipe repairman on a fringe colony nobody had heard of. Rail had not slept well. Behind him came Counselor Bren, the senior human liaison to the conclave. He was a small, nervous man who had worked his entire career to make humans seem credible and serious in galactic politics. He had dressed very carefully this morning and was already sweating through his collar. Colony Director Peel met them at the gate. She was a practical woman and hid her confusion admirably. She made the appropriate greetings, said the appropriate words, and then led them to Sector 9. Dale was under a housing unit, fixing a support strut that had been cracked since spring. Suri was sitting on top of the housing unit watching birds. Suri was no longer the size of a dog. In 3 weeks, she had doubled. She was now roughly the size of a large pig, with wings that spanned wider than that, and she watched the delegation walk toward her with the calm, heavy attention of something that had already decided it was not threatened. Ambassador Rail stopped walking. He stared at the dragon, then at the pair of boots sticking out from under the housing unit, then back at the dragon. "Is that," he started. "Dale," Director Peel called. "You have visitors." Dale slid out from under the unit. He sat up, took in the delegation, and looked at his hands, which were covered in grease. He wiped them on his work pants, which did not help. He stood. "Hi," he said. Counselor Bren stepped forward urgently and said, in a low and pained voice, "Dale, these are very senior conclave officials. Please just let me do the talking." "All right," said Dale. Ambassador Rail did not wait for the counselor. He looked at Dale with the expression of someone solving a math problem that kept returning wrong answers. "You are the one she bonded with," Rail said. It was not quite a question. "I think so," said Dale. "I don't really know how it works." Rail's jaw markings pulsed. "What did you do to compel the bond?" Dale thought about it honestly. "I sat with her, and I didn't want anything from her." The silence that followed was long. One of the conclave officials behind Rail pulled out a scanning device and began running tests. Dale stood patiently while they swept it around him. He had the easy stillness of a man accustomed to being ignored while people did things near him. "No psychic signature," the official said. "No genetic distinction markers," said another. "No military record. No political standing." "No," the official paused. "His primary listed skill set is structural maintenance and fluid system repair." Rail's markings went very bright. He turned to Counselor Bren. "This," Rail said carefully, "is the problem." Counselor Bren made a sound that was not quite words. The Orveth bond was sacred under conclave law. Every species in the galaxy recognized it. You could not break it. You could not contest it. You could not buy, argue, or legally maneuver around it. The Orveth elders had been contacted the moment the bond was detected, and their response had been 4 words that had since been repeated in every high chamber in the conclave. "The hatchling has chosen." That was it. That was the whole statement. No apology, no explanation, no room for appeal. Which meant the man currently wiping engine grease on his pants was now, officially, the first human Orveth bonded in galactic history, with all the rights, legal standing, and diplomatic status that carried. Counselor Bren cleared his throat. "Dale, you're going to be given a title. A formal one. And responsibilities." "What kind of responsibilities?" Dale asked. "Significant ones," Bren said carefully. "It will require you to leave the colony. Travel. Attend sessions of the conclave. There is a great deal of politics involved." Dale looked at Suri. She had descended from the housing unit during the conversation and was now sitting beside him, her shoulder at his hip height, watching the delegation with her amber eyes. She made a low sound in her chest when he looked at her. Not a growl, more like an affirmation. He looked back at the delegation. "Can I finish the strut first?" he said. "It's a load-bearing one. If I leave it cracked, the whole north wall of that unit shifts in cold season, and then 3 families have a drafty winter." Ambassador Rail stared at him. Counselor Bren closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," Bren said. "You can finish the strut." Dale nodded and got back on the ground. The most important diplomatic moment in human history proceeded with Suri sitting guard over the ambassador's very expensive shoes, and Dale finishing the repair that needed finishing, because the families inside that housing unit had a cold winter coming, and that was not something he was going to leave undone. Vethora Prime was the kind of place designed to make visitors feel small. The conclave seat was built from stone quarried off 3 different moons and assembled over 4 centuries. Every corridor was tall enough to fly a small ship through. Every room was lit to highlight whoever stood at the center. It was architecture meant to communicate power, and it was very good at its job. Dale found the whole thing a little cold and thought the ventilation was poor. He had been on Vethora Prime for 6 weeks, and in that time, he had done the following. Attended 11 official meetings, mispronounced 4 ambassador titles, asked a Salvari trade minister why a trade agreement needed to be 40 pages when the core of it was 12 sentences, and accidentally sat in a seat reserved for a council member during a formal session because the chair looked empty and his feet hurt. Lyra, his assigned aide, had developed a persistent twitch above her left eye. She was 26, human, ambitious, and had studied conclave protocol for 8 years. She had wanted this posting. She had not expected this posting to be this. You cannot just ask the Drakven consul why he's angry, she told him, after the 3rd incident. There is a process. There is a procedure for determining the appropriate channel through which concern may be. He looked upset, Dale said. I asked. He took it as an insult. He said yes, though. He told me what was bothering him. Lyra opened her mouth, closed it. She wrote something very small in her notebook. Suri was growing at a rate that alarmed people. By month 3 on Vethora Prime, she was the size of a transport shuttle. She had to be housed in the outer landing bay, and even there she filled most of the space. She spent her days lounging in the bay with her head turned toward whatever building Dale was in, tracking him with patient certainty. When he came back each evening, she would lower her head and breathe against him, the warm exhale of recognition that had become their daily greeting. The Orveth elders sent an observer, Elder Vaughn. He was the oldest living member of his species, which meant he was older than most governments. He was large. Even dragons have sizes, and he was much larger than Suri, and he moved with the deliberate economy of something that has long since stopped wasting energy on unnecessary motion. He arrived and watched. He watched Suri. He watched Dale. He watched the way the bond sat between them, which apparently was something he could see. He said very little for 2 weeks. Then he came to find Dale one evening in the landing bay, where Dale was sitting against Suri's foreleg reading a technical manual about atmospheric condenser units. Because old habits were hard to break, and besides, the colony still sent him repair questions sometimes. Vaughn settled beside them. For a while nobody said anything. She is large for her age, Vaughn said, eventually. I noticed, said Dale. Not just physically. The bond is deep. Deeper than we typically see at this stage. Vaughn's voice was low and textured, like something that had been worn smooth over centuries. She is growing in response to what she receives from you. Dale looked at Suri. She had her eyes half closed in contentment. What does she receive from me? I'm not anything special. You endure, Vaughn said simply, without becoming hard. That is rarer than you think. Dale considered that. The political challenge came the next morning. General Stav of the Drakven was a decorated military commander. 8 campaigns, for commendations, the kind of bearing that filled a room. He objected to Dale's presence in the conclave chamber on procedural grounds he had clearly researched specifically to be obstructive. He was not subtle about his disdain. In the middle of a session, with 60 diplomats present, he stood and said, A maintenance worker from a fringe colony has no standing to speak here. The Orveth bond does not grant wisdom. It grants proximity to an animal that made a peculiar choice. The room went very still. Outside, in the landing bay, Suri stood up. She had not been called. She had not been signaled. She simply stood, walked out of the bay under the open sky, positioned herself behind the chamber's main window, where she was visible to everyone inside, and opened her wings. She did not roar. She did not posture. She simply spread her wings to their full span, which at that point was wider than the chamber building, and stood there in the late afternoon light, luminous and enormous and deeply unimpressed. 60 diplomats watched her. Several quietly moved their chairs back. Ambassador Rail's jaw markings went completely dark, which, Lyra would later tell Dale, meant the Salvari equivalent of going very pale. Dale said to General Stav, calmly, I don't think I've offended you personally. If I have, I'd like to know how. Stav said nothing. He sat down. That evening, Vaughn found Dale again. The elder dragon was quiet for a long time before he said, the last time a dragon reached this size at this bond age, it was 400 years ago. Dale waited. The bonded was not a warrior, Vaughn said. She was a woman on a generation ship. She had spent 30 years delivering children in difficult circumstances. She had never lost her patience. He said nothing more that night. But the weight of it settled on Dale in the dark, the understanding that something old and large was paying attention to him for reasons he had not yet fully earned the right to understand. The Keldara Accord was old enough that nobody had invoked it in 2 centuries, which meant nobody had needed to dust it off and read it carefully until High Arbiter Sorrel did exactly that. The clause was real. Every newly bonded Orveth pair was required to demonstrate a worthy bond within 2 years of the choosing. In practice, this had always been a ceremony, a formality, a celebration. Nobody had ever used it as a test designed to fail someone. Sorrel was Salvari. She was also extremely good at the kind of legal precision that could take an old clause and reshape it into something with teeth. She announced the trial at a formal session with the satisfied calm of someone playing a card they had been holding for a long time. Dale listened to the announcement. He asked Lyra afterward what exactly the Keldara trial involved. Lyra explained. 3 stages. Tactical, diplomatic, a final, classified ordeal, designed over centuries for bonded pairs who were warriors, strategists, decorated leaders of people. And I have to do this, Dale said. Yes. When? 6 weeks. Dale was quiet for a moment. Is there a manual? There was not a manual. The trial took place on Keldara, a militarized moon where the rock was dark and the gravity ran slightly higher than comfortable. The observation platforms were full. Every species in the conclave had sent someone to watch. Most of them expected it to be short. Stage 1 was a combat simulation, a sealed environment, a tactical scenario, enemies that adapted. It had been built and refined by Drakvin military strategists and was calibrated for decorated commanders with years of wargaming experience. Dale walked in carrying nothing. He looked at the simulation environment the way he looked at every broken system, methodically, without assumption. He did not try to fight his way through it. He started looking at the edges, at the joints, at the parts where the design assumed a certain kind of thinking and built everything else around that assumption. He found 3 structural inefficiencies in the simulation's own logic. He used them. The simulation tried to adapt. He found where it couldn't. He did not win with force or strategy. He won by finding the places where the thing was slightly broken and applying patient, targeted pressure. The Drakvin observers were deeply unsatisfied. What he had done was not impressive. It was not heroic. It worked. Stage 2 was diplomatic. A seated scenario, 2 factions, real representatives, a mediated negotiation with no correct answer. Dale was supposed to guide them toward resolution. He was terrible at formal negotiation. He forgot to use titles. He paused at wrong moments. He asked questions that broke protocol because he genuinely wanted to know the answers. He asked one faction's representative why they really cared about the territorial boundary, not legally, but actually. The representative was so startled by a direct, honest question that he answered it honestly. Then Dale asked the other side the same question. Both answers exposed the real fear underneath the political position. And once both sides had said their real fear out loud, in a room full of witnesses, neither of them could pretend the performance was the truth anymore. A genuine conversation began. It was uncomfortable and unpolished, and it reached an agreement in 4 hours that formal negotiations had failed to reach in 4 years. Lyra watched from the observation booth. She pressed both hands flat on the glass and did not move for a long time. Stage 3 was classified. No observers. A sealed chamber. They separated Dale from Suri. The chamber was designed to test the bond through isolation, sensory monotony, extended quiet, nothing to hold on to. The theory was that a bond under stress would fracture, that the bonded would panic, despair, or dissolve into whatever psychological weakness the isolation could find. Dale sat down on the floor of the empty chamber. He was familiar with empty rooms. He had lived in them his whole life. He had come home to silence more times than he could count, eaten alone more evenings than he had shared a table with anyone. The colony had needed him in the functional sense, the way a building needs a foundation, without anyone particularly noticing he was there. He knew how to be alone. He had learned it young, when his mother died and there was no one who thought to check on him. And he had gotten through it by being very small and very still and finding the next thing that needed fixing. He sat in the chamber and talked aloud, softly, because he knew Suri could feel him through the bond even if she could not hear him. He described the drainage canal where they met. He described the flatbread he had pushed toward her. He told her about the level 4 junction box and how the colony's winter heating would be more reliable now. He talked about nothing, and he talked about everything, and he was not performing calm. He simply was calm, the way stone is calm, the way old pipes are calm even when the pressure inside is high. On the other side of the sealed barrier, Suri sat completely still. The monitoring officials expected distress signals, elevated resonance, bond stress indicators, the measurable grief of separation. Instead, they got nothing. They ran the readings twice. Suri was not distressed. She was listening. The trial ended. Dale passed. High Arbiter Sorrel received the results with the expression of someone who had played a perfect hand and lost anyway. General Stav was in the observation room when Dale walked out. They looked at each other across the room. Stav said nothing. Dale nodded once, the way you nod at someone you don't have a quarrel with, and kept walking. Suri met him at the exit. She pressed her head to his chest, and he put both arms around her jaw, and they stood like that for a long moment in the gray Caldara light. The galaxy had built the best trap it could. He had walked through it by being exactly who he was. Nobody had counted on that being enough. It kept being enough anyway. The Vel Collective did not send warnings. They absorbed. In 6 months, they had consumed 3 inhabited systems along the Venn corridor, not destroyed them, absorbed them. Species, cultures, memories, folded into the hive and compressed until only function remained. The Conclave had been debating jurisdiction and liability for 4 of those 6 months, while a 4th system went silent. Dale sat in the chamber and listened to the debate for 4 hours. He had learned to read the shape of these meetings. He understood now that much of what happened in the Conclave was not actually about solving problems. It was about not being blamed for solving them wrong. Every faction wanted the outcome, but not the risk of being associated with the attempt. He waited until a natural pause, then stood up. "I'm going there," he said. Counselor Bren turned white. Lyra stopped writing. General Stav, who had been increasingly quiet in Dale's presence since Caldara, looked up with an expression Dale could not quite read. "You have no fleet," Ambassador Rail said flatly. "I have Suri," said Dale. He left the chamber before the argument could fully assemble itself. Suri was outside. She had been outside because she was now too large to enter most conclave buildings without structural risk. She was the size of a heavy cruiser. Her wingspan threw real shadow, and when she landed, the ground registered it. Her scales had deepened from pale gold to a richer amber ivory, layered and luminous. She glowed faintly in low light. Elder Vaughn had said this was a sign of bond maturity. He had said it very quietly, and to himself, the way you say something you knew was coming and are still moved to witness. Dale climbed up to her back using the harness rig they had built together after her 4th month of growth. She lifted off before he had fully settled, and he held the forward ridge with both hands and did not look down, because looking down was still something he was working on. Admiral Wynn met them at the Venn corridor boundary with 6 human military vessels. She was a compact, precise woman who had commanded human forces in 3 prior conclave engagements. She had made her professional opinion of Dale clear in every report she had filed. He was an untrained civilian with diplomatic status and a very large animal. She had filed those reports carefully, professionally, and with evident frustration. She stood on the bridge of her ship and opened a channel. "You understand," Wynn said, "that I am here because my orders say support the bonded, not because I think this will work." "I know," said Dale. "Do you have a plan?" Dale thought about this honestly. "Not exactly. I have something I want to try." A pause. "And if it doesn't work? Then we do it your way," he said. Admiral Wynn closed the channel and said something very quiet to her first officer that was not recorded in the official log. The Vel Collective appeared as a pattern, a dark geometric formation of ships that moved as one entity, No gaps, no variation. They did not respond to standard hails. They did not respond to conclave codes. They moved like a tide that had not yet decided to hit something, slow and inevitable. Suri positioned herself between Wind's fleet and the Vel. What happened next is not easy to describe using standard terminology, because what Suri did was not standard. The Orveth elders called it resonance breath, a deep frequency emission that could interact with hive mind network signals. Suri exhaled, and the exhale spread outward like a wave moving through water, touching the edge of the Vel formation. The collective paused. Not their ships, themselves. The hive paused. A stutter in the signal, a moment where the unified frequency wobbled. He said, aloud, through the open channel, so Wind could hear him too. You don't have to do this. Nobody responded. The Vel formation began to move again. Wind's fleet engaged. There was a battle, short, costly, precise. 3 of her ships took damage. 2 Vel ships were destroyed, which seemed to briefly confuse the rest of the formation the way losing fingers confuses a hand. Suri moved through the fight the way water moves around stones, not colliding, redirecting, using the gap between her own mass and the Vel ships to create pressure without destruction wherever she could. Dale kept talking. He talked to the frequency edge, the outer layer that Suri could touch. He talked to the part of the hive that had once been separate beings, that had once known their own names. The Vel advance stopped. It did not retreat. It stopped. And then, for the first time in 6 months of documented expansion, the collective opened a communication signal. One signal. Not a demand, not a threat, a request. 3 of the absorbed species were partially restored in the weeks that followed. Not fully. The absorption was not clean enough to reverse completely, but enough. Enough for some of them to find their way back to something like themselves. The footage of Suri was transmitted across every channel in the conclave within hours. A golden dragon the size of a warship, moving through a battlefield without fury, while a man in unremarkable clothes spoke into the dark. General Stav watched it in his quarters, alone. Admiral Wind filed a new report. It was very different from the old ones. The gathering of Orveth had not happened in over 200 years. They came from the far edges of mapped space, from the systems where even conclave ships did not casually travel. They came in 1s and 2s, vast creatures, each with a gravity to them that was not about size, but about age, about the long weight of things that have been alive so long they have become part of the world's memory. Vethora Prime had never hosted anything like it. The conclave's outer landing fields were not designed for this. They expanded them in 6 days, working continuously, because the Orveth did not wait. Elder Vaughn stood before the full conclave in a chamber that had been opened wide to let the gathered dragons see in through the outer walls. Suri sat behind Dale, which put her enormous golden head roughly level with the ceiling of the chamber. She did not fidget. She watched. Vaughn spoke without preamble. He described the last time a bond had produced what he was now observing in Suri, the rate of growth, the depth of resonance, the abilities emerging ahead of any recorded schedule. He went back 400 years to a generation ship called the Aravel, drifting the long dark between systems. On that ship, there had been a woman named Deva who had spent 30 years as the ship's only midwife. 30 years of other people's worst nights. 30 years of breathing through crisis without passing the panic on to the people who needed her to be steady. When the Orveth found her, she was 61 years old and had no idea what a dragon was. She had shared her dinner with a hatchling who had stowed away in a cargo bay. The hatchling had chosen her before she finished eating. Her bonded dragon had become one of the largest in recorded Orveth history. She had helped negotiate 4 peace agreements. She had never stopped delivering babies, either. There are accounts of her doing so on the floor of diplomatic chambers because the timing was not convenient and she did not consider leaving to be an option. Vaughn let the story settle in the room. Then he said, precisely and slowly, so there was no room for misinterpretation. The Orveth do not choose strength. We do not choose status. We do not choose ambition or beauty or the capacity for violence or any of the things your species have spent centuries measuring and ranking. We choose the quality that our kind cannot generate from within ourselves, the willingness to absorb suffering without allowing it to become cruelty. The chamber was very quiet. Humans produce this quality, Vaughn continued, in concentrations we have not found elsewhere. Not all humans. It is not a species trait. It is a personal one. It is rare in every species. But in humans, in some humans, it burns at a frequency our young can recognize before they are fully awake. Ambassador Rail's jaw markings were completely still. These humans, Vaughn said, tend to be the ones you are not looking at. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Counselor Bran, who had spent 2 years being quietly mortified by Dale, sat in his chair with both hands flat on the table and stared at nothing for a long time. General Stav requested a private meeting with Dale that afternoon. He arrived, sat down, and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, I was wrong about you. Dale said, it's fine. I want you to know I understand what I know, Dale said. It's fine. I mean it. Stav studied him. He was looking for the performance, for the polished, diplomatic forgiveness, for the thing people said when they wanted you to understand you owed them something. He did not find any of that. Dale just meant it. Stav nodded slowly and left. Lyra found Dale in the landing bay that evening, sitting against Suri's foreleg again. She had a datapad in her hand with the Conclave's formal revised protocol of choosing. Human worlds added to the eligible contact list. The language around species ranking in the choosing process struck entirely. The Salvari had objected. They had been overruled 12-3. She held it out. He read it, handed it back. What do you want now? She asked. He thought about it. I'd like to go home for a bit. Home, she said. Aldrin's post. There's a junction box on level 4 I never properly finished. I got called away before I could do the secondary coupling. It'll hold through one more winter, probably, but I'd rather not leave it. Lyra looked at him for a long moment. You know you don't have to do that anymore, she said. You have people now. Staff. There are entire teams who handle infrastructure on colonies like. I know, said Dale. I'd still like to do it. She nodded. She wrote something in her notebook. He suspected it was the most honest thing she had written in 2 years. He went back to Aldrin's post in the early part of winter. Suri could not land anywhere near the settlement anymore. She was simply too large, and the colony did not have fields wide enough that wouldn't alarm people. So she circled, high up, in slow tilting loops, golden against the gray sky, visible from every part of the colony. People came out of their buildings and stood looking up at her. Children pointed. Dale was in Sector 9 with a wrench and a secondary coupling and a very familiar pipe. A group of children had gathered at the fence to watch him. Not the dragon. Him. They watched him work with the focused attention of people who had decided that what was happening in front of them was important. He didn't notice for a while. He was concentrating on the coupling. When he did notice, he looked at them for a moment. Then he went back to work. Hand me that flat head, he said, to no one in particular. A 9-year-old reached through the fence and passed him the tool without hesitating. Above them, Suri tilted her wings and caught the updraft and rose in a long, slow spiral that turned her to gold against the clouds. The galaxy had learned what she chose. It was still learning what that meant.